$4.5 billion. Try to imagine that amount. It would take more than 12 years to spend it, spending $1 million a day. For one man, it wasn't just money. It was the tool he was going to use to buy himself a world. But how did one man manage to pull off a scam of this magnitude, defrauding governments and banks around the world? That man's name is Joe Low, and his story begins with one ingenious deception that became the foundation for his entire empire. He was born into a wealthy Malaysian family, but quickly realized that his family's wealth was nothing compared to the real power. From the outset, he shrouded the true extent of his family's capital in a fog, cultivating an image of a man who acted not in his own name, but on behalf of powerful and anonymous investors from the Middle East. He created a legend about himself that was far more valuable capital than his family's actual assets. This myth became his main weapon, which he later converted into billions. For him, education became a tool for building a network. The elite Harrow School in London gave him friendship with the stepson of the future Prime Minister of Malaysia. Wharton Business School in the U.S., connections with influential families from Jordan and Kuwait. He became an indispensable bridge connecting three worlds: the political elite of his country, the limitless capital of the Middle East, and the financial legitimacy of the West. He ingeniously grasped that all these forces needed each other, and he was the only one who could connect them. Fascinated by the power of government sovereign funds, Low proposed turning the model upside down. Instead of investing the country's savings, his fund would borrow billions on world markets with government guarantees. The embezzlement occurred at the very moment the funds were raised. The fund didn't need to be successful. All it needed was the ability to borrow huge sums. It was a perfectly designed debt pyramid scheme designed to plunder. In 2009, this machine was launched as One Malaysia Development Berhad, or 1MDB. The first deal was to show how it would work. The fund invested $1 billion in a joint venture with the private Saudi oil company Petro Saudi International. On paper, everything looked flawless. But almost as soon as the money was transferred, over $700 million of that billion was secretly diverted to the account of a front company called Good Star Ltd, registered in the Seychelles. This company was owned by one man, Joe Low. It would seem that the mystery is solved, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. Because the real question isn't where the money went, it's how the deal got approved in the first place. As it later turned out, all the agreements were reached not in boardrooms, but on board a luxury yacht off the coast of Monaco, in the presence of a Saudi prince and Malaysian Prime Minister, Najib Razak himself. So who was Joe Low really, if he could dictate his will to such powerful people? Perhaps the answer will surprise you, as it surprised me when I was researching this topic. But Joe Low was a nobody. He was a mirror reflecting the ambitions of the most powerful people. The secret of his power over the Prime Minister and the Saudi prince was not in his personality, but in the structure he helped create. The 1MDB fund was designed with a fatal flaw that was in fact its main feature. All legal responsibility was concentrated in the hands of one man, Prime Minister Najib Razak, who had sole authority to approve any transactions, and all operational control was with an unofficial advisor, whose actions were not subject to formal oversight, and that person was Joe Low. It was a deliberately designed system to prevent any oversight. This Prime Minister was the face and legal shield, and Low was the brains and hands operating from the shadows. They were not partners in the usual sense. They were two heads of the same dragon designed to loot the public treasury. The first theft had proved that, but that was only the beginning. The success of the first heist only whetted their appetites. $700 million was good, but they needed billions to really play the game. To raise that kind of money in the international markets, they needed something they didn't have: an impeccable reputation. They needed a brand that the world trusted. They needed a Wall Street giant that would put its name on their dubious projects and, in effect, sell their legitimacy to them. Their choice fell on one of the most powerful banks in the world, Goldman Sachs. But how do you convince such a giant to cooperate? How could an unknown fund from Malaysia run from the shadows past the security scrutiny of a Wall Street pillar? In 2012, the answer was found. Goldman Sachs helped 1MDB raise $3.5 billion by issuing 2 series of bonds. The bank's golden name opened the door to global capital. And as soon as those doors opened, the crooks struck a second, even more sophisticated blow. This time, the scheme was more complicated. About $1.4 billion of the amount raised was stolen and transferred to a Swiss account. The money went to a front company from the British Virgin Islands called Abar Investments PES Ltd. This name was almost identical to the name of the real subsidiary of the Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund, creating deliberate confusion for banks and regulators. This was no longer just a theft, but a financial fraud using a corporate look-alike. They managed to fool the whole world by using the Goldman Sachs brand as a cover. But this gave rise to a new, even more disturbing mystery. The bank received a fabulous commission for its services, almost $600 million, a sum that by some estimates was 200 times the usual amount. Were the best minds on Wall Street so blind that they failed to spot the obvious signs of fraud? Or was this exorbitant fee not just a commission, but the price of silence and complicity in the scam of the century? The question about Goldman Sachs is not one of blindness, but of cynicism. The answer lay not in the bank's official reports, but in the culture of profit-seeking epitomized by its key employees. At the center of the scheme on the bank's side were 2 men: Tim Leissner, Goldman's head of Southeast Asia, and Roger Ng, head of the Malaysian division. The bank would later try to portray them as unscrupulous employees, the sole culprits, but it was only an attempt to save its reputation. Leissner himself admits that their actions were very much in line with the culture of Goldman Sachs. They were not deceived. They were partners. The bankers met personally with Joe Low and Najib Razak, realizing who they were dealing with. The astronomical commission of $600 million was not just a payment for risk. It was payment for active complicity, for selling the bank's most valuable asset, its name, which gave legitimacy to one of the greatest scams of the century. Goldman Sachs became a bloody funnel through which the fraudsters siphoned off billions. Having gained such a powerful ally, Joe Low and his patrons took the final, most audacious step. In 2013, Goldman Sachs organized a third issue of $3 billion worth of bonds for 1MDB. The scheme ran like clockwork. Of these funds, more than 1/2600 billion was withdrawn into a bank account in Singapore. The account belonged to another shell company, Tanore Finance Corporation. The embezzlement machine was running at full speed, but this money was intended for the last and most important purpose. The year 2013 was a watershed year for Malaysia. The ruling coalition that had been in power for 61 years faced the real threat of defeat in a general election for the first time in decades. For Prime Minister Najib Razak and his shadowy advisor Joe Low, it was the moment of truth. A defeat meant more than a loss of power. It meant imminent investigation, exposure, and the collapse of their entire multi-billion-dollar scheme. Everything was at stake: their wealth, their freedom, their future. The stolen billions were no longer just trophies for a life of luxury. They were to become weapons. The final tranche obtained through Goldman Sachs' third bond issue was intended for just that purpose. More than $1 in 2600 billion deposited into the accounts of the shell company Tenore Finance Corporation were waiting to be spent. It was the culmination of an entire multi-year plan to turn the stolen money into unbreakable political power, and they made their move with unprecedented audacity. From the accounts of Tenore, an offshore company controlled by an associate of Joe Low, some $700 million was transferred directly into the personal bank accounts of Prime Minister Najib Razak. This happened just before the election, turning the personal accounts of the head of state into a giant shadow fund to finance the political campaign. This money flooded into the electoral process, creating a veritable financial tsunami. The funds stolen from the Malaysian people were now used to bribe voters and finance the biggest election campaign in the country's history. The opposition was simply swept away by this money avalanche. In the end, the ruling coalition emerged victorious. It was a triumph bought with stolen money. For Joe Low, it was the height of his power. The embezzlement was complete, and political power was concretized. He had not just stolen money. He had subjugated the democratic process of an entire nation. He had transformed himself from a shadowy financier into a puppeteer who had secured victory for an entire regime and guaranteed himself absolute immunity. The game seemed over. He had won. But while victory was being celebrated in Kuala Lumpur, a storm was gathering on the other side of the world, in a quiet office in Switzerland. A former Petro-Saudi employee, a Swiss banker named Xavier Justo, was secretly copying a huge archive of data from his company's servers. 90 gigabytes of information, 227,000 emails and documents proving how the very first billion had been withdrawn. He didn't know it yet, but in his hands was the key that could bring down this entire multi-billion-dollar empire. The real war was just beginning. Joe Low's empire, seemingly indestructible after his electoral triumph, had one vulnerability. It was built on secrecy, and in the digital age, no secret can be kept forever. The Achilles heel of this colossus was one man, Swiss banker Xavier Justo, a former employee of the Saudi company Petro-Saudi. Frustrated with his former employers, he decided to take revenge. Before leaving, he copied an internal archive of the company's servers. It was a digital bomb. 90 gigabytes of data, including 227,000 emails and documents. These files were irrefutable evidence of how the very first $1 billion from the 1MDB fund was stolen. They contain the entire chronology of the negotiations on the yacht in Monaco, the money transfer patterns, and the details of the creation of the shell company, Good Star Leti. Justo may not have fully realized the extent of the information he possessed, but he knew it was valuable enough to try and sell it. When the blackmail failed, he put the entire archive in the hands of someone who knew what to do with it. That person was Claire Rucastle-Brown, a British journalist and founder of the independent blog Sarawak Report. For years, she had been investigating corruption in Malaysia, but never before had she been exposed to anything like this. When she realized that she could not handle a story of this magnitude alone, she made a strategic decision and shared the information with the Wall Street Journal. particularly Tom Wright and Bradley Hope. Now one of the most influential newspapers in the world is on the case. In the year 2015, there was thunder. The Wall Street Journal published an article that blew up the information space. Based on the Houston leak and their own sources, the journalists reported the stunning news. Nearly $700 million from the accounts of companies associated with 1MDB had been transferred directly to the personal bank accounts of the current Prime Minister of Malaysia, Najib Razak. This was no longer just a story of sophisticated financial fraud. It was a story of corruption at the highest level, backed up by documents. The response of the Najib Razak regime was desperate, swift, and ruthless. The so-called Week of Long Knives began in the country. The first to be sacked was Attorney General Abdul Ghani Patail, who appeared to be heading his own investigation team into the 1MDB case and was ready to indict the Prime Minister. His removal was tantamount to decapitating the official inquiry. What followed was a political purge. The Deputy Prime Minister and other cabinet ministers who dared to publicly question the Prime Minister's version of events or ask uncomfortable questions about the money in his accounts were immediately stripped of their posts. At the same time, the authorities launched a campaign to suppress dissent in the country. Opposition politicians were arrested, and websites publishing revelations, including the Sarawak Report, were blocked throughout Malaysia. For a while, it seemed that this tactic of total suppression had worked. The internal investigation was halted, critics were silenced, and the information field was cleaned up. Najib Razak and Joe Low, using the full might of the state machine, managed to win the battle domestically. But they did not realize that the war had already gone beyond its borders. Information about the global scam, backed by documents, had crossed oceans and reached the desks of people who could neither be dismissed nor intimidated. On the other side of the world, in Washington, D.C., the United States Department of Justice launched its own investigation as part of its Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative. For U.S. prosecutors and FBI agents, this was not politics, but the pure maths of money laundering. They began methodically tracing the path of stolen billions through the global financial system. The case of 1MDB was officially labeled the biggest kleptocracy case to date. And now the most powerful legal machine on the planet was playing against Joe Law. The U.S. Department of Justice struck back with a non-trivial but extremely effective tactic. Instead of immediately trying to get at the elusive Joe Low or the immune-protected Prime Minister, they launched a war against the stolen assets themselves. Using civil forfeiture, they filed lawsuits not against people but against things: yachts, aeroplanes, mansions, and paintings, proving that they had been bought with dirty money. A global hunt for Joe Low's treasure began. It was these treasures that best illustrated the scale of the embezzlement. U.S. prosecutors began methodically dismantling the luxury empire Low had spent years building. They followed the trail of his legendary parties, where he earned the nickname The Whale, the name given to the most lavish players in Las Vegas casinos. At his 31st birthday party, guests were entertained by Britney Spears jumping out of a cake. He hired a Boeing 747 to celebrate New Year's Eve twice in one night, first in Australia and then flying across the dateline in Las Vegas. The confiscation list included the main symbol of his wealth, the 91-meter super yacht Equanimity, a floating palace worth $250 million. The yacht, with its cinema, spa, helipad, and gold leaf interiors, was discovered and seized in Indonesia, then handed over to Malaysia and auctioned off. She was followed by a $35 million private jet, and an extensive collection of luxury properties in Beverly Hills, London, and New York. The art collection, on which Lowe spent more than $200 million, attracted special attention of the investigators. He bought masterpieces not as a connoisseur, but as an investor, using art as an ideal asset for money laundering. His collection included works by Picasso, Monet, Van Gogh, and Basquiat. He gave many of these paintings to his friend, actor Leonardo DiCaprio, who was forced to hand over all the gifts, including priceless paintings, to the U.S. authorities after the scandal began. Joe Lowe's empire was crumbling before our eyes. Every headline about the confiscation of another yacht, mansion, or painting was another nail in the coffin of Najib Razak's regime. News of the incredible luxury in which the crooks bathed amid the country's economic woes enraged the Malaysian people. Public discontent, fueled by the revelations, grew by the day. The ruling coalition, which had seemed indestructible, was rapidly losing support. The general election of the year 2018 was approaching, and for the first time in the 61 years since independence, the unthinkable seemed possible. Could an entire regime that had ruled for decades collapse under the weight of the scandal it had tried so desperately to bury? The whole of Malaysia held its breath. The month of May in the year 2018 has gone down in Malaysian history. The impossible had happened. The ruling coalition, which had held power with an iron fist for 61 years since independence, suffered a crushing defeat in the general election. The MDB scandal, which Najib Razak tried so desperately to bury, was the main reason for his political demise. The Malaysian people, tired of corruption and lies, gave their verdict. A new government led by veteran Malaysian politician Mahathir Mohamad came to power. One of his first decrees was to immediately reopen the investigation into the 1MDB case. The icy hoop shackling justice has been broken. For Najib Razak and his entourage, it meant the end of everything. The reckoning had begun. The police searched the former prime minister's residences, and what they found stunned even the most experienced investigators. The results of the searches were a clear symbol of the greed that plagued the top brass. Cash, over 500 designer handbags, including the rarest Birkin models, 12,000 pieces of jewelry, and hundreds of expensive watches were seized. The total value of the seized property was estimated at $270 million, the largest asset seizure in Malaysian history. The country watched live as treasures bought with money stolen from it were removed from the palaces of its former rulers. Shortly thereafter, Najib Razak was arrested and tried. In July 2000, he was found guilty of 7 charges, including abuse of power and money laundering. He was sentenced to 12 years imprisonment, an unprecedented case in the country's history. The former prime minister, who seemed omnipotent, went to jail. His wife, Rosma Mansour, was also sentenced to 10 years for corruption. Justice, albeit belatedly, was served. The circle has closed. Almost all of the main participants in the scam ended up in the dock. Goldman Sachs bankers were convicted in the U.S. The prime minister's stepson, Hollywood producer Riza Aziz, avoided jail in exchange for the return of assets. Saudi businessmen have been convicted in Switzerland. The system they had spent so long building collapsed, burying its creators under the rubble. But there was one major unfinished chapter in the story. While his accomplices stood trial, the chief architect of the whole scheme, the brains behind the operation Joe Lowe, simply disappeared. The brains of the whole operation turned into a ghost. In 2016, Interpol put him on the international wanted list, issuing a red notice, Lo himself, from his safe haven, continues to deny any guilt, claiming he is a victim of political persecution because of his support for the defeated regime of Najib Razak. He maintains the image of a man who has been unfairly vilified, but Loe leads a very comfortable life. According to numerous reports by investigative journalists, Joe Lo is not hiding in the jungle or on abandoned islands. He leads a luxurious lifestyle in a mansion in Shanghai's ultra-exclusive Green Hills neighborhood. It is alleged that he moves freely around China, enjoying his wealth and remaining completely out of reach of the justice system in Malaysia, the U.S., and Singapore. His freedom turned the case from a purely financial offense into a complex geopolitical issue. Joe Lo has become a valuable asset and bargaining chip in the fragile diplomatic relationship between Malaysia and China. Negotiations over his possible extradition have become intertwined with major infrastructure projects under China's One Belt, One Road initiative and the struggle for regional influence. Beijing, meanwhile, continues to deny Lo's presence on its territory, despite compelling evidence to the contrary. Thus concludes this grand saga. Joe Lo, who began his journey by creating a myth about himself, became a myth himself. He has turned from a master of financial fraud into an important pawn in the global game of great powers. His ultimate fate now depends not so much on justice as on big politics. The man who wanted to buy the world ended up as a commodity on the global political market, and his story has become an eternal reminder that in a world of big money and big power, justice is not always the final authority. So, what conclusions can we draw from Joe's story? The story of Joe Lo has shown that the era of primitive corruption with suitcases of cash is irretrievably gone. We live in an era of global, systemic kleptocracy, where crimes are committed not in spite of the system, but with its help. The most respected Wall Street banks can become a tool for embezzlement, and the noble purposes of public funds can become a mere screen for the plunder of an entire nation. The idea that this is only possible in the cinema is the main vulnerability on which fraudsters of this magnitude rely. The apotheosis of this cynicism was the fact that the production company of Joe Lo, on the money stolen from the Malaysian people, made a Hollywood blockbuster, The Wolf of Wall Street, with Leonardo DiCaprio in the lead role. By the way, a good friend of Joe's before he was exposed. The film glorifying financial scams was funded by one of the greatest scams in history. The criminals literally laundered their reputations by turning dirty money into Hollywood glamour. The modern global financial system is not just a mechanism for investment. It is an efficient market where legitimacy is a tradable commodity, and the brand of a respected bank or the name of a Hollywood star is not just a symbol of success. It is a universal key that can open the door to the trust of the whole world. Stealing billions is no longer something out of a spy film. It's a streamlined business where entire countries are just lines on a list of potential targets. And remember the main lesson of this story. The greatest vulnerability in the system through which $4.5 billion were withdrawn was not a complex financial instrument, but human greed and willingness to believe in a charismatic man who promised access to inexhaustible wealth. Be extremely vigilant. Don't believe in fairy tales of easy money. Always question the origins of capital and take big names and brands as seriously as your own savings. Your financial hygiene is your greatest defense. As always, your Mr. Dark Web.